This video will discuss a position paper, a particular type of argumentative essay in which a student supports a claim with evidence derived primarily from research, with a limited amount potentially coming from personal experience as well. The position paper may also include a counterargument and refutation, as well as appeals to ethos and pathos, along with other rhetorical devices. For students in my ENC 1102 class, the last essay is a position paper, and it represents a culmination of all we have studied throughout the semester, allowing students to at last implement all they have learned throughout the semester to advance their own arguments about an issue of their choosing. It's the most extensive of our assignments, and I believe it to be the most challenging, and so it's the assignment we spend the most time discussing and working on in the final weeks of the semester. We'll begin with an overview covering some of the characteristics of a position paper. The first point is that the position paper is a research-based essay that makes an argument stating a specific claim about a specific issue and supporting it with evidence. The goal in this type of paper is to convince the audience to agree with a claim, and so the focus is on the writer's opinion and on asserting the opinion forcefully and persuasively. It makes clear what is the issue, the claim, and the writer's evidence in support of the claim. And finally, and this is an important point, the position paper is a research-based essay that derives the majority of its evidence from research using credible, scholarly, and reliable sources of information, a point that we'll be returning to throughout the video. I also think it's a good idea to quickly compare this paper to the other type of paper that students write in ENC 1102 and that we spend a lot of time with, the rhetorical analysis essay. In the rhetorical analysis essay, the writer analyzes someone else's argument, telling if or not they think it was persuasive and why, while in the position paper, the writer asserts her or his own opinion on an issue. And while in a rhetorical analysis essay, the writer assesses how well someone else proves a claim, in the position paper, the writer seeks to prove her or his own claim. And just one more time, and I'll be returning to this point several times as we move through the video, the position paper is a research-based argument. The claim is supported by research taken from scholarly, credible, and reliable sources of information, and should include information that is not commonly known. The key is to uncover surprising facts that will be persuasive to the reader. It's very likely that if you're watching this video, you've probably already studied the material in the companion video, Fundamentals of Argumentative Writing, which students in my ENC 1102 classes are required to study at the beginning of the semester. But if you haven't done so already, make sure you've watched that video and that you've got a good understanding of the information covered there. It's very important to know that information in order to understand what we cover here. I'll also be referring to the information from that video throughout this video. We'll start with a review of the information that was covered in the video Fundamentals of Argumentative Writing, connecting that information to how we'll go about writing the position paper. Remember we said that there are three essential components that any argument must have. First, an argument must identify a problem, which we called the issue. Second, the writer must propose a solution to that problem, which we called the claim. And third, the writer must provide some form of evidence showing why the solution should be accepted by the reading audience. Remember that we defined an issue as a problem that two or more people are facing, which forms the basis of an argument. And remember that in order to be an issue, there must be disagreement among reasonable people about how to solve the problem. As an example of what an issue is, we'll use the issue that will form the basis of the argument in the example position paper that we'll be discussing at the end of this video. The issue of that paper is, should individuals make the choice to purchase more of their food from local sources rather than large national grocery stores? The second essential component we discussed is the claim, which we defined as a statement about how a writer or speaker proposes to resolve the issue. Remember, we said that the claim must make a clear connection between the problem and the solution. We'll also take as an example the claim that will be used in the example position paper that we'll discuss at the end of this video. The claim in that example paper is, more people should make the choice to purchase a greater share of their food from local sources rather than large national grocery chains. One aspect of the position paper that will be different from the arguments you've studied so far this semester is that the claim will be stated as a clear, direct, and easily identified thesis statement. The thesis statement will clearly state the writer's claim, connect it to the issue, and provide a sense of the argument's organization. We'll look at a few examples here, beginning with the thesis statement that will be used in the example position paper we'll discuss toward the end of the video. Given the enormous benefits to individual health and to the environment, along with the demonstrated cost savings, it should be clear that maintaining a diet derived from local sources is well worth the effort and added time due to the proven health benefits, the benefits to the environment, enhanced food safety, and lower cost. Notice that this sentence states a clear position on an issue, a position that not everyone would agree with, and offers the author's opinion and setting up the evidence that will be offered in support of the writer's opinion. Here's another example. At least 25% of the federal budget should be spent on helping upgrade business to clean technologies, researching renewable energy sources, and planting more trees in order to control and or eliminate pollution. I think it's also helpful to quickly discuss 3 errors that I frequently see when students set out to write an arguable thesis statement for the position paper. These are kind of extreme examples, but I think you'll get the idea. One is that students often make a simple statement of fact like, healthcare is expensive. A statement like that is just a simple statement of fact that no one can disagree with. It doesn't make an arguable claim that someone can write an argument about. Another common error students often make is just making a simple subjective statement of taste or opinion, like Chipotle has good food. Now certainly there's disagreement on that question, but what's missing is reference to an issue, a problem that a group of people is facing. And the third common mistake is to confuse a statement based on belief or faith with a claim on an arguable issue, as when a student might offer as a claim, the earth was created by an omnipotent God. Again, there's certainly disagreement, and some might say it also references a problem, but the type of arguments we're discussing here and the strategies we're learning to support them are about concrete issues that, while we might all disagree on the solutions, we all agree are problems to begin with, making statements of faith or belief beyond the boundaries of the position paper. Another good thing to keep in mind when crafting a thesis statement is that the solution to any problem will be true in certain circumstances but not true in others, so it's important to state the claim using language that reflects the limitations of the solution offered, which is referred to as qualifying the claim. A few well-placed words and phrases can do this, and a few are provided in this chart as examples, words and phrases such as sometimes, for the most part, and in most cases. One example is the claim freedom of speech must never be infringed upon, which might sound good to a lot of people on the first reading. The problem is that this claim as it's written would protect hate speech, which is speech that incites violence against a particular group, something people almost universally agree is not only morally and ethically wrong, but also dangerous, and it's illegal and already strictly punished under the law. A revision to that claim, which we can refer to as a qualified claim, is, in nearly all cases, freedom of speech should be protected, though instances of hate speech should never be acceptable. The third essential component discussed in the earlier video is evidence. Remember we said evidence is anything that could persuade your audience to agree with your argument. Remember that we defined evidence as facts and ideas readers cannot disagree with, even if they disagree with the argument in its totality. Remember, too, that we said evidence will generally comprise most of an argument, so in your position paper, you'll spend most of your time in word count presenting evidence in support of your claim. And we discussed 4 categories of evidence, which were data, irrefutable facts, expert testimony, and anecdotes. And we'll spend just a few moments running through the definitions and examples of each of them. And this is a good point to once again emphasize this important point that the position paper is a research-based argument. The claim is supported by evidence from research taken from scholarly, credible, and reliable sources of information. It is not simply a list of reasons why you believe something or a narrative of personal experience in support of an argument. That would be a much simpler task. One of the categories of evidence that you might use is data, which we defined as findings of researchers published in recognized academic journals. Data is considered among the most persuasive forms of evidence in modern times. One example of data used as evidence in the example position paper is the following. The agriculture sector is now the single largest contributor to carbon emissions, generating fully 1/3 of carbon emissions worldwide. You'll notice that no specific number is mentioned there, but it still refers to a measurement taken from research, which makes it an example of data. Another example is taken from one of our earlier reading assignments. 500,000 deaths were linked to diseases caused by poor diets from factory farm foods. Another type of evidence is irrefutable facts, which we defined as a statement of what is that any reasonable person could not disagree with. And again, irrefutable facts used in the position paper should be taken from research and should represent information that is surprising and interesting and that is not widely known already. One example from the position paper we'll be discussing is, Modern diets are so bad, in fact, that life expectancy for Americans has now declined for the first time in more than 100 years. And another is, exposure to synthetic pesticides in factory farm food has been shown to be potentially devastating to human health, with well-established links between the ingestion of pesticides and the development of cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and birth defects. Expert testimony is another form of evidence, and we defined it as the opinions of recognized experts in fields allied with the issue under discussion, often found in the arguments these experts have written on the same issue. One example is, noted food writer and New York Times columnist Mark Bittman has written that subsidies paid by the federal government to large farmers have led to larger farms that use more chemicals and produce lower quality food. And a final type of evidence is anecdote, or personal story that illustrates how the writer's claim would resolve the issue. Anecdotes can make a greater impact than data and fact, but should be used sparingly, and this is especially true in the position paper. You can bring in your personal experience, and personal experience can be persuasive, but it should represent only a small portion of the argument. Also discussed in the earlier video was the concept of warrant, and you learn that an argument's evidence must be clearly connected to the claim. This connection to the claim is called warrant. It is a logical bridge that connects the evidence to the claim. The warrant may or may not be stated explicitly, and often it is implied. The important point is that it must be clear how exactly the evidence supports or proves the claim. Here's a new example taken from the position paper we'll be discussing. If the claim is, more people should make the choice to purchase a greater share of their food from local sources rather than large national grocery chains, and the evidence offered is the agriculture sector is now the single largest contributor to carbon emissions, generating fully 1/3 of carbon emissions worldwide, then a warrant that ties that evidence directly and explicitly to the claim would be the carbon emissions produced by the agriculture sector are the result of the long distances over which food is transported. But buying local eliminates the need for transportation and the carbon emissions that result. Therefore, people should buy more of their food from local sources in order to reduce carbon emissions to the benefit of everyone. Just saying that agriculture produces lots of carbon emissions doesn't explain how buying local food would solve that problem. The warrant here makes that connection clear. There's pretty extensive coverage of the concept of logical fallacies, which we defined as the problem that occurs when the warrant is not sufficient to tie the evidence to the claim in the earlier video, The Fundamentals of Argumentative Writing, and I'll mostly just refer you back to that video for review. I do often spot logical fallacies in students' position papers, and it's a problem that can take students some time to correct between the first draft and the final draft, so it's a problem you want to avoid if possible. Most of the logical fallacies I see, however, are of two types, so I'll review those quickly here. I pretty commonly spot circular logic in students' papers, which remember is when a claim is restated, usually in different words, as evidence, as in this example. If the claim is, we should protect endangered animals, and the evidence is, it is important that endangered animals survive, that doesn't really say anything different from the claim, though there's lots that could be said in support of that claim. Another logical fallacy I see pretty often is hasty generalization, which is when a writer offers evidence that is insufficient to justify the claim because it is too limited, particularly when using data that was not gathered according to commonly accepted principles. And the example we looked at had as its claim, TCC should lower its tuition by 20%. As evidence, the writer offered an informal survey of 20 students found that 76% agreed tuition is currently too high. And that really doesn't provide the opinions of a large enough group of students to make such a sweeping claim. We also covered in the video Fundamentals of Argumentative Writing some of the optional components of an argument, aspects of an argument that are not required but that a writer may choose to include and that can make the argument more persuasive. These components are considered optional when we're talking about arguments in general, but in the position paper, one of these optional components is going to be required. We'll take a second look at those here as well, with some additional examples thrown in that are more pertinent to the position paper. One of the optional components when speaking of arguments in general is counterargument and refutation, but these two elements will be required in the position paper, so it's important that we review these two concepts very intentionally. Remember that we define counterargument as briefly summarizing an opposing argument and refutation as clearly explaining why the writer disagrees with the opposing argument. As an example, we'll take a moment to look at the counterargument and refutation from the example position paper. Here's a copy of the paragraph that contains the counterargument and refutation from the example position paper. Pause the video for a moment and read through this paragraph. Here's a summary of the counterargument and refutation from the paragraph you just read. The claim for the argument is that more people should make the choice to purchase a greater share of their food from local sources rather than large national grocery chains. The counterargument is that large farms produce really cheap food, which has virtually eliminated world hunger. And even as the person who wrote the argument in favor of local food, I have to admit that's a pretty strong counterargument. But after some careful thought, I was able to come up with a refutation you saw in that paragraph, which was that large farms won't be able to produce that cheap food for very long because they're stripping the land of its nutrients, and will need small, sustainable local farms to replace the food that we now get from these large industrial farms. Another optional component of an argument that you may want to include in the position paper is background information, which we define as an explanation about how the problem arose, who it affects, and why it's important. Here, a writer often seeks to make readers care about the problem and why it's important to the writer. You also see on the screen here the example from our first reading assignment, which was included in the video Fundamentals of Argumentative Writing. And we also talked about establishing ethos as an optional, though encouraged part of forging a strong argument. We defined ethos as the ways in which a writer establishes credibility, inspiring in the reader confidence in the writer's trustworthiness so that the writer is taken seriously and the audience listens to the argument. Remember that ethos is established at the micro level through the selection of particular words and phrases and through presenting the evidence in a way that inspires confidence in the audience. In the earlier video, we talked about several ways of establishing ethos when thinking about arguments in general, but two are especially relevant when writing a position paper, and attending to them when writing a position paper can certainly make for a stronger, more persuasive paper. One is establishing ethos by building common ground. This means encouraging your audience, which may include people who do not agree with you, to think about ideas, beliefs, and values that you hold in common. This can enhance the perception of your trustworthiness, and it can be especially helpful when writing to an audience that may not agree with your claim. As we move into the example position paper, which again makes the argument for people to buy more of their food from local sources, notice that the argument makes an appeal to those who may associate the local food movement with left-leaning political ideologies. The argument attempts to establish common ground with people who have a more conservative political orientation by noting the cost savings to the federal government and society as a whole that can come from people making healthier choices, as reflected in this short paragraph from the essay. Another way of establishing ethos is by doing what is required when writing academic papers anyway, and that's transparently documenting the sources of your information, making an effort to not only cite sources, but to highlight the strength of your research through well-placed signal phrases, like in this excerpt. Notice that the text in red points out that the evidence was derived from a Time magazine article, which is a well-regarded source of information. The last optional component of an argument that we discussed is the appeal to pathos, or making the reader feel strong emotions about the issue and the claim. This is often accomplished by making people think about their values for things like protecting vulnerable populations such as children and the elderly. In the excerpt you see here, the impacts of pesticides on children are offered as a means of stirring strong emotions in the audience. Pause the video for a moment and read through this paragraph. One of the final topics we'll cover here is a brief discussion about how to organize the ideas in your position paper, what to say in each paragraph, and so on. And the first thing to know about the position paper is that there are many approaches to crafting an argument. I'm not going to give you a formula telling you what you must write in each paragraph, although we'll be looking at an example outline that will work just fine if you follow it. The important thing, though, is to make the components of your argument abundantly clear. It must be clear without your saying so what constitutes your claim, your evidence, your counterargument and refutation, and so on. You can think of organizing any kind of argument as similar to shuffling a deck of cards. The various components of an argument, the claim, evidence, background information, and counterargument and refutation can be shuffled into any order. And for the position paper, you're not necessarily going to be required to present these components in a particular order. But there are two very general approaches to organizing an argument. The more common is known as deductive reasoning. In this approach, the argument begins from the claim, which is usually stated within the first or second paragraph, and then presents the evidence to prove the claim. Deductive reasoning is by far the more common and understandable, but if you're looking for a challenge, you might opt for inductive reasoning, which lays out the evidence first, leading the reader to the claim, often stated at the end of the paper. Inductive arguments can be very persuasive, allowing the reader to feel that she or he is coming to a conclusion independently, but they can be difficult to pull off successfully. Here's a sample outline for an argument that utilizes the deductive approach, as the example essay does. In the outline, the writer starts with an introduction paragraph that includes background information that both explains the issue and encourages the reader to care about the issue. This is followed by a thesis statement that clearly articulates the claim. Then the writer lays out the evidence, again drawing most of it from research, across 6 paragraphs, followed by a paragraph that presents a counterargument and refutation. The essay ends with a brief conclusion paragraph that summarizes the claim and leaves the reader with an impression of the strength of the writer's argument. Now we'll turn to the example position paper that I've been referencing throughout the video. If you're a student enrolled in my class, a copy of this position paper is posted on Canvas. I'd suggest pausing the video and downloading and printing the example paper and then reading it. You'll notice that this example position paper follows the outline we reviewed a few moments ago. First, background information is presented so that the issue is made clear. Also, an attempt is made to inspire readers to care about the issue. This is followed by a thesis statement, shown here in red, that summarizes the claim. You'll also notice that the sources of information are clearly documented with in-text citations highlighted here in yellow, which is essential in all academic writing. Drawing from a range of sources and clearly documenting them also builds ethos in a position paper. The counterargument and refutation are found toward the end of the paper, and language is used to clearly indicate that the writer is referring to an opposing argument and clearly articulating why that argument is not accepted. Finally, a complete works cited page formatted according to MLA guidelines is included that appropriately documents the source of all the information used in the paper. That concludes this video on the position paper.